Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session, Advanced Targeted Cyber Attacks, the past, present, and the future. Entities behind advanced targeted cyber attacks have been using wide scale of sophisticated methods, from 0 days exploits to social engineering and malware that is capable of penetrating all the systems that are used in the most secure companies in the world. In this session, we are lucky to have 3 excellent speakers, Mr. Arturi Lehtio from F-Secure, Mirko Marketti from University of Modena and Reggio Emilia, and Mark de Berg from Arcadia. Our session title has 2 adjectives, advanced and targeted. And during this week, we have already heard some sessions where we have been talking about APTs. But in this session, we categorize these APTs under this title of the session. So we want to talk also about attacks that might not be lasting very long, which might be really getting in and stealing the stuff and getting out as fast as possible, or other types of attacks. There are different actors, purposes, and desires result behind these attacks. Adversaries might be stealing specific critical data to be carried out as fast as possible, or they want to destroy digital or physical assets. We shall hear various scenarios during the following presentations. As mentioned during the workshop days, the term APT is frequently misused, and it has become like a marketing buzzword. Many organizations are using APT term also when they see any type of attacks coming to their networks, just to explain that they have been under really advanced attacks. During the session, we shall also hear how enterprises might be able to determine if they have been really under advanced attacks, or perhaps they have been also only been compromised just by chance. Our first speaker, Mr. Arturi Lehtio, he comes from F-Secure. He's working there as a researcher in Helsinki, Finland. His work focuses identifying and tracking suspected state-sponsored threats and threat actors, as well as understanding how the tools and tactics evolve over the time. He has been participating in several conferences, such as Virus Bulletin, Secure, T2, and Countermeasure. We had some discussions during the CyCon. I tried to find some funny things to tell about him, but as he is a Finn, there wasn't any funny about him. So please, stage is yours.
So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arturi Lehtio. If you didn't already realize from the introduction and from the way I'm dressed, I'm a technical guy. I'm not a policy guy. I'm not a politician. And I'll be talking about real-world target attacks from my perspective. I purposely left out advanced from the title. Not all target attacks are advanced. Not all successful attacks are advanced. And they clearly don't need to be advanced to succeed. I won't talk about any single specific case or actor or group or threat. I'll talk about the types of trends, the types of challenges we're seeing right now with targeted attacks, how they're evolving, and how that comes through in some real-world cases and examples. So, start off, you may remember this case from last summer. Supposedly, Russia hacked the email systems of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as a result, those email systems were shut down for over 11 days, which sounds serious, and I can imagine was. There's another interesting news article about that same case. interesting, especially due to some specific details it mentions about that case. For instance, it mentions that the attacks or the breach was successful as a result of spear phishing and human error, not technical vulnerabilities. So not the newest, most advanced next generation zero-day rootkit, or I don't know what the marketing term right now is, but simple, well-known techniques like spear phishing that's been around for a long time, and human error. But there was another detail. Officials were disturbed by the speed of the attack. So the combination of simple, proven techniques and speed combined to exploit human error, human weaknesses, was enough in this case for the attackers to be able to breach those systems. Now, we'll get back to that in a minute as well, but there is one more interesting detail in that story. It mentions that the same perpetrators are believed to also be behind earlier breaches related to the US White House and State Department email systems. Now, that again is important, relevant, and interesting for multiple reasons, but the one that's most personal for me, the reason why it's personally so interesting, is because it would mean that this case was related to an earlier case, suspicions of monkey videos being used to hack President Obama's emails. Now, I don't know about President Obama's emails or Russian hackers gaining access to those, but I know the monkey video really well. It's, again, a familiar, personally relevant video for me. It's this video, which is a Super Bowl advertisement, I think from 2007, purports to show monkeys at an office. I believe it was a management consulting company who was advertising, I guess, their consulting services, how to fix the problem of monkeys messing around your office. But this video was used as a decoy in targeted attacks, in spear phishing attacks, specifically in July 2014, and specifically by this group, known as the Dukes, or APT29. And the reason this group is personally relevant and close is because I spent a year researching this group and their over 7-year history, trying to understand where they came from, how they evolved, what they were doing, what was motivating them, what their objectives, what their goals were, how they were succeeding. I mean, they were at it for over 7 years, so they had to have been doing something right. But as I mentioned, this group focused on espionage. And so it's probably safe to assume that if it was this group who was, as the media has reported, if it was this group who was behind, for instance, the Joint Chiefs of Staff hack, then perhaps their primary objective was espionage. However, the story also mentions no classified material was compromised or stolen. Now, we all probably know that doesn't mean nothing sensitive was stolen, but even assuming that it would mean nothing sensitive, nothing important, nothing valuable was stolen, that the attackers failed to steal anything worthwhile, anything useful for espionage purposes, does that mean the attackers failed? Does it mean they didn't succeed, that they lost, and that the defenders won? Well, the attackers are probably the only ones who can actually answer that, but I'd point out the email systems used by top military commanders were shut down for almost 2 weeks. I'd at least count that as an effect. Whether that was their original objective or goal, I doubt it. Personally, I think their primary objective was espionage, but I'd still count that as an effect. Also, the fact that it was apparently the same guys who'd earlier in the year gotten into other high-value systems. The simple idea of the same guys keep breaking into your house or your castle or your fort again and again doesn't really make you feel too good. It has a very strong demoralizing effect. It has a lot of effects in and of itself The idea that these guys keep coming back. And if you look at it from a perspective of someone who trusts these organizations, their government, to keep them safe, secure them from these types of guys, reading in the news that the same criminals or the same robbers or the same thieves keep getting back in, doesn't really reassure you much. So in this case as well, for the defenders, their primary objective probably was to ensure nothing sensitive is leaked or stolen. And apparently they succeeded in that, so they won. But does that mean the attackers lost? Because I'd argue this isn't a zero-sum game. I'd argue that even though the defenders won in many ways, they managed to prevent the leak of classified information. The attackers also won. They might not have won at the game they initially set out to play. They may have changed the rules while they were at it. You might call that cheating. They'll just call it winning. They still succeeded. And I think that's something that's important to keep in mind, that it's not always, they don't always have a clear objective, and they definitely don't stick to one objective and just keep going at it, even if they, in the face of a defender who's actually succeeding. And that's one area where I think lines are blurring in many ways. It's not as clear-cut as we'd like to think. It's not as clear-cut as most of us probably believe. It's a lot blurrier. It gets a lot more confusing and mixed up because there are so many different ways for both sides to succeed at the same time. And so I think it's also important to keep in mind it's not a zero-sum game. Both sides can win, both sides can lose. But staying on the topic of blurring, another area where that's happening is tool sets. This is a timeline of different tool sets used by the Dukes, the group I mentioned. All of these tool sets are custom developed for their use. No one else uses them. It's just theirs. And they're quite complex, quite large tool sets, many of them. They've taken quite a bit of effort, time, money, resources to actually develop these tools. And they've spent 8 years at least developing those tool sets, developing the different tools that they can then use for their actions. But in this case, it's still quite clear-cut. These are their tools for their specific purpose, and they're the ones using it. But again, it isn't as clear-cut anymore today. You may remember or recognize this company, for instance, Hacking Team, an Italian company that produces essentially hacking tools, hacking software. They call it the hacking suite for governmental interception. They sell it to governments, to law enforcement, to intelligence agencies. Essentially the same type of tool set, but in this case, it's produced by a company who sells it to anyone who's willing to pay. And it gets even more complex because, as many will also remember, last July, they were breached. Someone managed to hack into their systems and dumped a huge amount of their internal data. Things like internal emails, but also things like the source code to their hacking platform, their hacking toolset. And that source code is openly available on the internet. Anyone can go and download it from GitHub and compile it, and they'll have their own hacking toolset or hacking platform. And in fact, if you're wondering, well, after you've compiled it, how do you use it? Don't worry, there's a manual in the dump as well. As this blog post that dug into the content shows, the technician manual, and I believe there were also the system administrator's manual and a couple of others for different user groups. So you can follow along, and it's a very simple graphical user interface, just mouse and keep clicking and dragging pieces around. And if the compiling part sounds scary to you, there's a setup wizard as well. You only need to know how to click next. There's probably a box that says, I agree with the terms and conditions. Just remember to check that one as well. Probably says, I won't use this for anything illegal, but who cares anyway? So it's very easy to get started with these types of tool sets, and probably isn't a surprise that these days we're tracking multiple independent clusters of, for instance, RCS Galileo usage, which is the product name for this Hacking Team's toolset, which we see both actors who've just taken the setup wizard, installed the system, and they're just running that, probably following with the manual on their desk. We've also seen cases where someone's using what's clearly a modified version of it, but it's also very hard for us to tell whether that's hacking team's proprietary updated version or whether someone's just downloaded the source code and modified it for their use cases. But this is another case where, for instance, on the toolset side, again, lines are blurring. It also means, for instance, in earlier times, in the case of even of the Dukes, they had to have developers with enough skills to write those tools. And that was one obstacle that any group who wanted to get into this business of targeted attacks, they had to overcome that. They had to have enough knowledge, enough skills to create those tools, so they had to find someone to create those tools for them. Now, you don't need to know anyone smart. You don't need to be smart yourself. You need to just Google and download. Now you can get started in the business with no skills, essentially. So that's another area, again, where lines are blurring and things are getting more complicated, more complex. Now, a step further, some of you may remember Game Over Zeus, which was a notorious banking Trojan botnet back in 2013, early 2014. At its time, arguably the most profitable such botnet, purported to profit the owners or the operators of that tens of millions of dollars. And what they did was they stole banking credentials from normal home users, and they used that to steal money from their bank accounts. Towards the end of their activities, they also figured out another way of monetizing, which may also be familiar to you, which is file encrypting ransomware. This is the group that started CryptoLocker and wrote that and started infecting their victims with CryptoLocker to monetize that way as well. So they were pure criminals. They were in it for the money, for the profit. And in 2014, beginning, I think early June 2014, so about 2 years ago, they were taken down as a joint effort by various law enforcement agencies and industry partners. And it was actually a successful takedown. It managed to stop their activities. And the creator and the operator, or the mastermind behind this, was one Evgeny Mikhailovich Bogachev, who is now wanted by the FBI. I think the reward is $3 million. So they figured out who was behind it. And if you see him, give the local police a call. This is another picture of Bogachev. I believe this is one he's taken himself. You may look at that and think he definitely looks criminal, and I'd agree with you. You may even think he looks kind of like a really bad Bond villain, but you probably wouldn't think he looks like James Bond or the next Spy Master. But fact of the matter is, Game Over Zeus had some interesting twists to it. Some very specific groups of infected computers were essentially taken out of the big botnet, the one that was making money for the criminals, and moved to a separate, smaller cluster that was being handled, micromanaged by a few specific individuals involved in the operation. And those machines, no one was interested in the banking credentials of those users. Those were all governmental computers in specific countries like Turkey, Georgia, Ukraine. And what the attackers did on those machines was search for specific words in file names, words like classified or top secret or the names of local intelligence agencies. So very clearly for espionage purposes. Now, no one knows how things worked out, whether this was one theory is that perhaps the government got to these guys and asked them to do some extra work on the side for the government. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if these guys were running a highly successful criminal operation. They realized that kind of as collateral damage, they'd also managed to infect governmental computers, valuable computers, and they just saw the value of those, being smart criminals. And they decided they could make an extra profit by actually selling the information from those computers and not just the banking credentials. And by the way, Bogachev is still at large, so I don't know if he made enough friends with this to perhaps have helped him stay safe and stay out of jail. So in any case, this is also an example of highly opportunistic, highly for-profit criminal operation with no apparent connections to what we'd see as espionage, but the end result for these countries, for these instances, was still spying, espionage, and someone probably benefited a lot from the information that they were able to steal from those systems. So again, an example of how lines are blurring between different types of activities, different types of actors, different goals and purposes. As I mentioned, for instance, in the case of the Dukes and the purported JCS hack, of whether their initial goal was espionage and they changed objectives midway through when they realized they wouldn't achieve that. In this case, their initial goal was probably just to make as much money as possible by stealing from innocent civilians. But again, perhaps they changed their minds halfway through for these machines, realized they could make even more money if they changed their objectives, if they changed the rules of the game. And this type of blurring is something we see in quite a few places, in quite a few things. For instance, between targeted and opportunistic. The Game Over Zeus case is one great example. In some ways, I'd use the Dukes as an example as well. A lot of their operations, a lot of their high publicity successes as well, were actually cases where they sent out emails to hundreds or even thousands of targets, emails that pretended to be, you've got e-fax, or someone's trying to send you a PDF, or you just scanned this with a printer. Documents, emails that are usually used to spread ransomware, spread banking trojans. Documents that are not targeted specifically at those, or don't look targeted specifically at those individuals. And they were being quite opportunistic about it. But it seems in their case, for instance, they knew by sending enough of those emails, they'd get enough people to click, and they'd still succeed. So they were being very opportunistic about it. And that's also a case, for instance, where I personally believe they chose to use such generic content for the emails on purpose, because that content is something that security people, systems administrators run into every day. It doesn't look out of place for them. It looks like the next batch of ransomware or banking trojans. So yeah, they'll notice that that looks suspicious, but they'll add it to the pile of things I need to get to once I can, and go digging for the next advanced APT targeted attack without realizing that it was actually this email that they just moved away. Once they get around to looking at it, a couple of days later maybe, at that point it's too late, game over. The guys have already gotten in, and they've probably already gotten what they wanted. Another thing where lines are blurring, and this is definitely not a new idea. This is something that's been talked about a lot, but still, criminal and state-sponsored. There was even a panel about it yesterday. Lines are blurring. Is it criminals being paid to or coerced to do state-sponsored activity? Or in the case of Bogachev, is it just criminals realizing they have something of value? Or the other way, state-sponsored actors realizing they have valuable skills and they could be making even more money on the side? When talking about objectives, is it for profit, for espionage, for something else? And does it have to be just one of those? Can it be all of those? Also, in the case of tool sets, commodity or custom, the Dukes used custom tools. Hacking team software, I'd count that as commodity at this point, but many are using it, and some are using it quite successfully. In general, between tools and techniques and the way those are used, again, lines are blurring. An important one to keep in mind is physical and cyber, or kinetic and cyber, or how you want to think about it. An attack, even if the target is to get data off of a computer system, doesn't have to start with an email. It could just as well start with the janitor plugging in a USB stick. It probably doesn't take too much money to pay off a janitor, give them a couple thousand extra, and they might just as well stick that USB stick into the machine. That's your way in. Now you're in the computer system. So it's always important to keep in mind when you're talking about computer security to also remember the physical security. And like I mentioned earlier, winners and losers. Who wins, who loses? Can everyone be a winner? My mom always told me, no, you can't always win. But in these cases, I think sometimes everyone can be a winner. Sometimes everyone's a loser. That definitely happens as well. So these are some examples of where we see lines are blurring between different methods, tactics, types of attacks, different ways of operating. And the point here is I feel we often succumb to tunnel vision. We decide there has to be some clear path, some clear objective, some clear distinction, and we try and desperately find that. But perhaps sometimes it's just not to be found. Sometimes everything's just all too blurred up. Thank you.
Thank you, Artturi. We have some Estonian present, something to grow. So please, if anyone has questions, please raise your hand and ask for the microphone and ask the question. When waiting the question, of course, I was joking when I was talking that he's not a funny guy. He's really funny.
Hi, Richard Gold, Digital Shadows. Great presentation, thanks a lot. Appreciate the technical aspect of that. So with everything blurring, as you suggest, what way do you see forward in sort of making sense of this kind of a world where you don't have these distinctions that we were used to?
Good question. I'd say one important thing is sometimes we think we need to find a clearer distinction when it actually doesn't matter that much. One example is, for instance, the case of attribution. If you're a prosecutor, a lawyer, or law enforcement, yeah, you need clear attribution, you need to have evidence that will stand up in court, and you need to be able to name names of who the perpetrators are. If you're protecting organizations, defending organizations, do you really care whether the guy's name is Vasily or she or John? Or is it more important to understand their motivations, their preferences, their ways of operating, their goals, their tactics, things like that, where it might be. So you can make it a lot easier for you if you don't try and find a clear distinction, at least in every aspect. Focus on the ones that are actually important and relevant for your use case. Someone else might be looking at totally different things because for them, those things are more relevant. So hopefully that gives some ideas.
All right, there's next one.
Hi, Larissa Breton. To follow up on your last statement, which I thought was excellent, what are some common factors that any organization should look to when they evaluate what they want to keep and what they want to not look for?
Well, the first thing to understand is why would someone be interested in your organization? And then you can start working from there which types of groups, actors might be interested. I mean, if you're a small business, for instance, ransomware probably would be your biggest problem, and you'd probably want to focus on that. And that's one area where don't even try and figure out the different actors and the different tools. Try and figure out, ways of protecting yourself, like having offline backups and not using shared network drives, things like that. If you're a defense contractor, you probably have some idea of what the valuables are in your organization. You probably have totally different types of enemies, at least the priority targets. And then when you understand which types of actors might be after you, you can start to try and understand what types of shared techniques, tools they might use. There's a lot more commonality than you might imagine of tools and techniques, but the challenge right now is we often, when we think about defense, for instance, we try and think about very specific technical things like a specific malware family or specific file, and not about the techniques in general, for instance. So that's also something where, again, don't get bogged down on which sample or which malware family. Think about the techniques, the tools, the methods. Hopefully that answers. Yeah.
Hi, Patrick Maldry from the CIPA Cyber Defense Initiative in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Artturi, for a great presentation. The lines are blurring. I'm wondering if you're also seeing some what appear to be multi-state targeted attacks.
I'll interpret that as where multiple states are working together against a common target. As far as I know, that's not happening per se, but that doesn't mean multiple states aren't benefiting from a single piece of activity, a single attack, for instance. Those of you who've looked at, for instance, the Snowden documents may have heard of something called third-party collection or fourth-party collection, where it's precisely someone has breached an organization, someone else has breached an organization you're also interested in, you breach the attacker, and you get the information they're collecting, and kind of there's an extra step in between you and the real target. So that's something that apparently is happening and has been happening for quite some time.
All right. Thank you for all the questions. And thank you, Artturi. Let's have applause. And our next speaker is Mirko Marchetti from Italy. He is working as a researcher for the Inter-Department Research Center of Security at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. He is an expert in cooperative network intrusion detection and prevention, fault-tolerant distributed systems, high-performance systems for information security management, and cloud security. So please.
Thank you for your introduction. Well, just a disclaimer to begin. I am too a technical guy. I'm just here in disguise, so be prepared. I'm here in this talk to share about you some results of our latest research about countering advanced persistent threats. And we are especially focused on helping security experts and system administrators that every day work hard in our networks to better detect advanced persistent threats. In particular, this kind of advanced persistent threats, or APTs for short, that tend to last quite a lot of time before being detected. So this is our main focus. Now, actually, there are several different kinds of advanced persistent threats, and as Artturi said before, some campaigns are targeted, some are less targeted, but we are especially focused on targeted campaigns. So when an attacker tries to willfully steal sensitive information from a specific organization, of course, these are usually high-profile organizations. Or maybe attackers might be involved in sabotage. So they might want to destroy a system or render an information system unavailable or something like that. Well, this, of course, is definitely in the scope of this year's CyCon of cyberpower. So this is why we are here today. And actually, this kind of targets are maybe not hard as they should be, but they are also not so easy. In order to launch an effective targeted APT campaign, attackers do not only need quite effective technical means. They do not only mean to be technical experts. They also need several other skills in different areas. So, for example, they need to be very good at intelligence. They need to gather lots of information about the organizations they want to attack. Organization related to both the architecture, the infrastructure, the software and hardware infrastructure of the organization, so such as, for example, public-facing services, the software and hardware configuration of internal clients, and so on, but also related to people working for the organization, so, for example, for the employees, their contacts, and their roles. They use all the information they gathered from intelligence to devise a new malware that is specifically targeted to hit their target. And this is the technology step. So they could, in the most high-profile attacks, devise a completely new zero-day for a specific target, or in most of the cases, it just suffices to take an existing malware and tweaking it just a little bit in order to avoid detection from standard antivirus systems. But after you have created your malware, you need to implant your malware inside the organizational network. And more often than not, this is not a step involving technology, this is a step involving psychology. So the most effective vectors is a human being. And usually what it happens is that the attacker just asks for an employee to install the malware on their behalf. Of course, this is not an open request. This happens through social engineering attacks, such as very common examples of spear phishing emails with attached infected documents or links that will eventually lead to the download and execution of malware on the victim computer. And from now on, attackers have the first foothold on the victim organization. Mean that this kind of access may be just only partial, very limited, with very low credentials, access to just one computer in an organization that may have hundreds or thousands of hosts. But this is the first spot from which attacker now can move inside the organizational network. And basically, attackers do three kinds of stuff. They try to maintain access, so they want to consolidate their presence in the host they compromised. And they do so by downloading other malware that includes basically remote administration tools, backdoors, something like that. They do what we call lateral movement, meaning that they use the hosts inside the organizational network as a pivot to scan for other for other hosts to compromise. And this serves a twofold purpose. So first of all, attackers gain a better presence inside the network, so it is more difficult to eradicate the attacker if lots of hosts are compromised. And moreover, they get to look at what compromised system contain. And they will, sooner or later, find the machines that contains the relevant data they were looking for in the first place. And when they gather that machine, when they gather the data, they can start the exfiltration phase. So they can, for example, take the data and just send them out, smuggle sensitive information out of the organizational network. All these kind of activities inside the victim organization can last for quite a long time before being detected, unfortunately. And just to give you an example, this is a short snippet of a timeline taken from an APT attack against the Swiss CERT. It's just a recent example. I'm not going to the technical details. There is a very nice technical report you can download and Google for if you're interested. But what I just want you to focus about is that the security experts inside the CERT identified for the first time the attack on January 21st, 2016, this year. And after they have identified the attack, they studied it, they identified what they call indicator of compromise, and then they looked backward in their log files to see when the attack started and trying to reconstruct how they were attacked and how the attack propagated within their network. Well, it didn't end very well because their research ended on logs related to September 2014, not because they really found the attack source, but because all previous logs had already been erased because they were deemed to be too old and useless. So we don't even know for how long attackers had remained inside the CERT network, but at least 1.5 years. And we will never know how much data they were able to gather and exfiltrate during this period of time. So the question now is why detection is so difficult? Well, this is because, as we've seen, and also as Arturi said in the previous presentation, advanced persistent threats are not only technical means. They also they are very human-driven. It's not a matter of machine against machine or software against software. It's a matter of people against people. So we do have advanced attackers, but what we lack usually are advanced defenders. Not because these kind of people do not exist. They do exist, but because most of the times organizations only deploy technical countermeasures. So our attackers know about technology, about intelligence, and about psychology, but our defenses are limited about technology, software that we can deploy in the network appliances. Mind, you need them. I'm not going to say that you don't need a firewall, you don't need an intrusion detection system. Of course you need them. They protect you from the vast majority of attacks out there, but they are not able to protect you against a targeted APT campaign against your organization. So what we need, basically, since we have advanced attackers, are advanced defenders. Defenders that are well-versed in intelligence. Because how can I defend my organization if the attackers I'm trying to defend against know more about my organization as I do? So I do have to think as an attacker and gather the data I need. I also need to know about psychology. I really have to think about attackers too. Because even in the best case, when technology works, technology is just able to generate alerts saying, you know what, I saw a strange packet here, strange packet there, a little malware infection there. But there is need for someone to interpret this data and to be able to correlate and connect all these dots in order to reconstruct an advanced attack strategy. So my point here is that we need to keep humans in the loop. So we need to have domain experts, we need to have security experts working for securing our networks. Well, the main issue with security experts is that their time is few and the hosts to check are quite a lot. So they cannot just go throughout a complex organizational network every day. This is why we came out with the OSPEX framework. It is just a framework that is intended to help human analysts by allowing them to focus their scarce resources on few hosts that are more likely to be compromised out of the hundreds or thousands of hosts that comprise a complex organization. So it's not exactly detection. We are not saying, you know, that is an APT campaign. We are just signal you that that host is behaving weirdly, and that you should really check that host, even though that host might not be infected. The framework takes as input several kinds of information. So our main source of technical information is network traffic. We analyze all the network traffic generated by internal hosts inside an organization. Why we do that? Well, because even in large organizations, it is quite feasible to analyze all the network traffic by putting limited amounts of network sensors, provided they are well placed. On the other hand, if we would have liked to analyze all systems detail, so everything that is going inside every computer in the organization, we would have the need to deploy new software agent inside each computer in the organization, and that is much more complex and much more difficult to do and to manage in the long run. The other source of information we use is an asset list. Mind that that has not to be intended as a comprehensive asset list, as a comprehensive configuration management database. What we need is just a list of all the computer and devices within the organization, with a separation between client devices that are used by people and server devices. And for client devices, what we need is information about the employees to which the device has been handed out. So we want to know who is responsible, who is using that device. The last kind of information we need is basically OSINT, also open source intelligence, gathered from social network or public websites. And we'll explain better at that point later. So, what we do with this kind of information? Well, the first processing we do with information is computing what we call the compromise indicators. These are technical indicators that we compute analyzing network traffic, and we are basically, in our current version of the framework, 3 different indicators that are designed to analyze traffic and find traffic patterns that might be linked to common activities performed by an APT campaign. So we have an indicator for maintaining access phases, in which we basically try to identify when compromised hosts talk to the attacker that is controlling them. We do have an indicator for lateral movement, in which we try to identify infected hosts that are basically scanning the network, trying to find other hosts to compromise. And we have an indicator about data exfiltration. Now, for time reasons, I'm not going into detail into all these indicators. Of course, if you're interested in the details, you can find them in the paper, or you can ask at the end of the session. I'm just giving a few more details about data exfiltration. The problem with data exfiltration is that our ability to detect data exfiltration really depends on how the attacker exfiltrates data. If you're lucky, the attacker just finds a bunch of data, so large bunch of data, like 1 gigabyte, 10 gigabytes or more, and tries to smuggle the data out of the organizational network as fast as possible. This is basically a high and fast data exfiltration, and that is quite easy to detect. This is just, in the table, you can see the performance of a simple detector just based on analyzing the amount of traffic that is going out of the network, applied to a quite large network. It's a network with about 6,000 to 7,000 active hosts per each day, so it's quite a large network. And we can see that we are always able to detect quite easily data exfiltrations of at least 1 gigabyte or more. On the other hand, performance are terrible if data exfiltration is 500 megabytes or less. So we are not able to detect this kind of exfiltration. Now, mind that 50 megabyte is just a daily site. So an attacker that stays in the network for quite a lot of time might be able to smuggle quite a lot of data, 50 gigabyte at a time, 50 megabyte at a time, I'm sorry. And we do have some contribution in this field. We just came up with a better detector that is actually able to increase the detection rate also for low and slow data exfiltration. As you can know, it's not perfect. It can be improved, but it is just a clear improvement over the state of the art. So we have 500 megabyte that we can detect quite reliably, and even for small exfiltration, like 50 megabyte per day, we have a quite good detection rate that basically depends on the host that the attacker selects as a source of data exfiltration. Of course, these results are just applied to one big network, so they may vary depending on the network traffic profile and other characteristics. So we compute our 3 compromise indicator, put all of them together, and what we end up with is just a score for each client. So we compute a score for each client inside the network based on their network traffic behavior. Then we rank all hosts based on that score, and we end up with a list that basically has in the first place hosts that are more likely to be compromised, hosts that should be attentioned earlier by security experts. And just to show you how effective is this approach, you can just take a look at the slide. I know it is a mess. In that slide, each point represents one of the 6,000 hosts inside a client network. And it's very confusing. You can also see from there that the problem of handling 6,000 hosts is quite unmanageable, right? On the y-axis, we have the compromise score. So hosts, which means dots, that are higher in this diagram are dots, hosts, with a higher compromise score. So by statistical means, we can just separate hosts whose compromise score is statistically significantly different from the score of the vast majority of the hosts, and single out, in that case, just about 100 hosts out of 6,000 that compose our network, which is, I mean, the problem is just becoming more manageable from a human analyst. But this is not the end. This is just an intermediate result. Now we take this list of about 100 hosts, and using the ASIC list, we associate each host, each client machine, to the people that uses that client. So now our attention focuses from machines to persons using these machines. And using open source intelligence, what we do is basically crawling social networks to compute what we call exposure indicators related to a particular person. Why do we do that? What is our target? Well, what we want to do is to try to identify which employees among my organization might be the low-hanging fruit for an attacker. So which employee might be more easily targeted by a social engineering attack, such as, for example, a spear phishing email. So there is not a definite answer on how to do that. We just came up with an answer that we are experimenting with. And one possible answer would be to automatically evaluate the attitude of an employer to share both personal data as well as organizational data. Why personal data? Because if I share a lot of personal data to the public, then an attacker, for an attacker, it's much easier to design a spear phishing attack very targeted to me that I'm more likely to fall for. On the other hand, if I share organizational data, such as, for example, the name of project that might be even confidential project I've worked in the past or I'm working with now, an attacker may find out that I am a valuable target, more valuable than other, so may try to attack them instead of attacking other. What Housepack does right now is that it computes 4 different exposure indicators. One related to social activity, meaning how active I am on social networks, so how much attention do I attract. Social connections, how many connections do I have? So how good I am as a hub, for example. Because if I have a lot of connection, an attacker impersonating me might be able to trick lots of people, all my connections. Personal information leakage, so how many details about me I share, and organizational information leakage, how many information about my organization, my role, my projects I do share. Now, of course, again, for the sake of time, I cannot go into detail, but just to give you a hint about the information you can gather just by swifting through public social network profiles, just have a quick example. This is a snippet from a LinkedIn profile of a random guy here. And he just listed some certifications. So we have some quality certifications, some ISO certifications, and then among all these certifications, we find that. For those of you who are not Italian, I have a translation here. This is an Italian security clearance. This is required to handle confidential and secret information. Of course, this kind of information is not given to anyone. It's given to people that have to handle this kind of information to perform their job duties. So by just making that information public, I am signaling an attacker, hey, I'm here, I have valuable data, attack me. Okay? And this is not just an isolated case. Here is just another example in which the security clearance is listed against skills together with Microsoft Office or together with commissioning, troubleshooting, continuous improvement. Okay? So this is the kind of data you should be worried about if employees work for your organization. Okay. So what we do now we have 2 scores. A score that tells how a computer is likely to be compromised, a compromise score, that is computed from a technical viewpoint, and an exposure score, that is computed from an OSINT viewpoint. Well, we basically take the score and mix them together. So what we end up is a matrix. So you can see you have the compromise score on this axis and the exposure score on that axis. Dots, again, represent hosts inside my organization. Well, hosts and the people that use them. What we end up, of course, is that dots that are higher and on the right in this chart are dots that are more likely to be compromised, that are extremely suspicious because they combine both anomalous network behavior together with a very high exposure to social engineering. So these are the hosts on which security experts analyzing my network should focus their limited attention. And of course, once these hosts are cleared, it's free to go for all the other hosts in decreasing order. There is also a further study that Auspex now supports, and it is propagation analysis, meaning that I can take all these hosts that I consider suspicious, and I can just look if they are connected together. I'm not talking about physical connection, but about logical connections. So what I mean here? I mean that, for example, one of these hosts sent an email to another host inside the organization, or the two hosts exchanged chat messages, or they participate to the same file sharing group. So if my organization has an internal way of communication, and if I can access the log of that internal communication mean, then I can draw graphs in which nodes are compromised, well, suspicious hosts, not compromised hosts, and vertices are the communication that these two hosts entertained. So I can draw up this nice little cluster that may be of use for a defender because they may be helpful in identifying or studying possible propagation of malware inside the organizational network. So to conclude, I just presented you Auspex, the framework we devised, and some of its early results. I stress that the main goal of Auspex is not to identify APT, but just to help security analysts and security experts working for your organization to better focus, to make better use of their limited time and resources by focusing on the most suspicious hosts. This result is achieved by combining three very different kinds of data analytics. So we do have several algorithms borrowed from big data analytics applied to network traffic because as you might imagine, a network with 6,000 to 7,000 of active hosts generates quite a lot of traffic to be analyzed. We do have open source intelligence gathered from external social network, and we also have information about intra-organization information sharing. And that's all. Thank you for your attention. I will take your questions.
Thank you. Again, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone.
I don't know.
Kado Huopio, National Cybersecurity Center, Finland. Just wondering how universal is that model? I mean, do you have to fine-tune this model from organization to organization? And the second question is, do you, for this monitoring of inter-organization lateral movement of anomalous traffic, you actually have to be able to monitor the whole network from every point, if I got it right. How you can envision that to be done? Is it every server or every client should have a add-on program for monitoring? Or actually, can you do that on a network side for the whole network?
Okay, understood. I'll try to answer in order. So there are some aspects of this framework that are quite universal, meaning the algorithm that you use to analyze network traffic, they do not have to be specifically tailored to any environment. They just pretty much work. On the other hand, since we rely, for example, on an asset list, we need to be able to read the asset list of that organization. Also, we need to be able to connect people with devices, with client devices. So if an organization doesn't have this kind of data, then Auspex it's quite difficult to apply. On the other hand, as it is present, it is just a mean to adapt Auspex to ingest the data, and it pretty much works. So this for the first time, for the first questions. For the second question, yes, in order to be able to effectively detect lateral movement, you need to be able to analyze all traffic flowing inside the network. If it is feasible or not, it really depends on the physical organization of your network. So in a well-designed, well-defined network in which we have a few central switches that act as a hub, and in which it is not possible to attach hub derivation. So these are quite controlled networks, typical of large organization, very structured organization. This activity can be performed. Of course, it is not sufficient to have just one network traffic sensors. You need to deploy several traffic sensors. The number depends on the structure of the organization. You just take your central switches and configure a monitoring port or a spam port on there and connect to them. So this is the way to do that. It doesn't come at no cost, but in most of the cases it is feasible.
Silke Holtmans, Bell Labs. Just a brief question. You showed how social networks are, how you crawl social networks to get this kind of vulnerability scoring. Are you aware that also attackers use this kind of automated scoring means or similar automated means to find vulnerable ways into an organization?
Actually, I'm not exactly aware of that. Maybe Arturi may ask your question better than me. However, well, if they're not doing now, it's probably something they're going to do in the future. So.
Okay, there's one more.
Hi, Andrew Vance, University of Maryland. I worked with the Defense Information Systems Agency, and for 10 years, part of a project that dealt with the same issue. And I agree with everyone talking about APT, the advanced portion of that title, is sort of, belies the fact that those initial attacks are always spear phishing or malware drops that come from repetitious means, but there is a point in which it does become advanced. One of the things that we saw very challenging was looking inside the packets. The command and control was encrypted. The lateral movement was very difficult to discern whether or not. So your scoring mechanism is a novel approach, looking to identify suspicious hosts. We looked outside. We looked at the aggregated traffic going to destinations. But again, the advanced nature came in because they throttled the traffic, how often they beaconed. We were successful in coming up with an algorithm. But we only knew we were successful because we could go back months and months and months and attribute those suspicious APT reports with intel that came out later that those actors actually use those APT techniques. So my question is, how confident are you that this approach actually detects APTs? Because for us, there was a great delay with attributing that behavior towards any known APT. Does that make sense? Have you gone back and taken a look at the results and said that that is an APT?
Okay. Well, thank you for your question. It's very interesting. Actually, what Auspex aims to do is exactly help people like you in better performing their job. So you basically had a problem to solve. You started maybe with packet inspection, trying to devise signatures, for example, but that approach failed because the attack was encrypted, the traffic was encrypted. So you basically ended up with something that might be similar to what we have devised. You just identify an algorithm that maybe analyzes just network traffic, so you just relied on metadata, for example, source IP, destination IP, protocol used for connecting, and timing of communication, something like that. Well, these are all algorithms that can be embedded inside Auspex. So when you compute, for example, algorithm for lateral movement, we are not claiming that we have the definitive algorithm for detecting lateral movement, because, of course, APT is going to adapt. So given a specific algorithm, if this goes public, then attackers are just going to change the way they implement their command and controls and evade detection, exactly as they do with antivirus. So the main point here is not to be able to come up with a system that is able to immediately detect APTs, because I don't sincerely believe this is possible. At least I'm not clever enough to come up with such a system. But just to end up with a framework that will help you in carrying out this kind of analysis, so that next time you have to deal with a new APT, or you suspect that there is an APT inside your network, you have a framework to work with. You know that algorithm for traffic analysis goes there. You know that if you want to analyze the email of your employee, it goes there, and so on. So just to sum up, Auspex in its right, in its current form, it's not able to identify immediately an APT. And I don't even know if a technology will exist that will allow to do that. Auspex aim exactly to help people like you doing your job better and faster. That's all.
Thank you. So let's have no more questions for this session. We can discuss after the whole session. So thank you very much for the presentation. And here is a small present from Estonia. And the last speaker, not the least, is Mark de Berg. Mark is recognized by the cybersecurity community as one of the best reverse engineers in the world. He's working for Arcadia as a chief cybersecurity officer, and also as a mentor for other people working in Arcadia who work in the area of APTs. So thank you. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here today. So the title of my presentation is High Value Cyber Offensives. And the reason I chose that over APT is because I believe that not everything is advanced and not everything is persistent. So I thought that the title was a bit, shortened if I just, used the T. So I changed the wording, and I think, from my perspective as an ex-military person, this, offensive, defensive is something I understand quite well. So that's why I use that term. But please feel free in your mind, if you're stuck with APT, every time I say, high value cyber offensive, think APT and everything's fine. Okay, let's see if I can master this. All right, so traditionally when we think about cyber offensives or APT actors, we think about two types of people, and we're tempted to use the word, it's either a criminal or it's an organization, right? It's a government organization or something like that. I like to think about it a different way. It's more on the behavioral aspect. So I've named these people the gangsta and the traitor, okay? So your gangsta type is the guy that doesn't care if he gets caught, but he still goes after the high value things, right? So he's gonna go after the jewelry, he's gonna go after the cyber jewelry if you want, and he doesn't care if he gets caught. He's gonna be cocky in style because he doesn't care, right? He's fast, straight to the point, and most of the time, he's gonna be a mercenary. He's either going in to get value for money, or he's either going in to get something he can resell, or he's going to go in because that's what the contract says he has to do, right? And if as he's walking around trying to look for something, and he sees something else of value, he's not going to, consider, threat analysis. Am I going to get caught if I go this way instead of going straight to my thing? He's just going to try to grab as much as he can and run out the door very quickly. So they're very opportunistic in types of approach. To be honest, these people do a lot of harm to countries and entities and companies, but they're not the worst. I think these guys are much worse. From a defensive perspective, they're much harder to find. So your typical traitor, he will try to blend into your entourage and until you almost willingly let him in. And I said almost, I should have removed almost completely, because most of the time, you'll just quite happily click on his thing and say, hey, come on in, right? If it's not you, it's going to be somebody from your organization. And that's where, the advanced staff doesn't apply at all. It's really purely a social engineering aspect. So they'll identify, utilize your trusted space. So they'll understand your security probably better than you do. They'll actually try to leverage any weaknesses in your entourage, like, if they know that you go to your kid's school website to actually check their grades and things like that, or whether they're skipping classes and things, well, it's a perfect place to put a watering hole attack for you. These kinds of things are very important. Okay, they're going to be slow, they're going to be careful, And the thing that they're going to do is they're always going to be, they're always going to evaluate the risk of doing something, either a lateral movement, dropping a piece of software. They'll always evaluate that before they actually go and do it, right? So it's a bit like, in the Imitation Game movie, right? When they talk about, telling about Enigma that they've actually broken it. No, the plan is not to actually tell the world, it's to try to utilize the information as best as you can and actually evaluate what the threat risk is, right? And these guys are good at doing that. And the worst thing is they're in for the long haul, right? They will actually develop technology specifically for your network. So, don't think about your commodity, things. They will actually develop stuff for you. Okay. So those were just the traits of the two types of actors that we see out there. Now, let's look at how they operate. Okay. So traditionally, your traitor, because he's the one that's really important in this game. So, so typically, what he's going to look at, he's going to use as much public information as possible to try to understand you as an entity, your organization, the people that work around you, and your close entourage, right? And he's going to take his time. He's going to do his proper survey. And once he's identified your weakness, he's going to try to utilize that. He's going to use your typical, movement vehicle that will get onto any kind of terrain, right? So he's going to use something that he can reuse on your network, on somebody else's network, or another network, but something that's as generic as possible. I'm talking traditional, all the way up to today, and some actors are still doing that today, right? They'll use that big orange dumb buggy, and they'll try to make sure that they actually run this thing when you're not looking, because obviously it's bright, it's big, and it's noisy. But really, they don't care because they've actually studied you long enough to know when you're not looking. So they'll just run this thing when you're not looking. They will try to leave as many accesses as possible. And I'm not saying that they're going to leave the same backdoor on a whole bunch of different hosts. Maybe I should have colored the doors, different colors in here. Because really, your good trader will leave different types of backdoors or ways back into your network. Remember, that's traditional. Things are changing slowly. And they'll try to move to as many places as they can inside of your network. That used to be true, to try to get as much information as they can so that they could do this. Essentially, carve out everything that you have and haul it out, right? So the traditional picture of high-value offensive done by the trader is this, right? You have your guard sitting at the front. He's your antivirus, right? Your IDS, your, all these things, right? You got your tech support who's sitting in a little box behind, all these guarded things. And sometimes he moves, but, he's a big thing that moves not too fast. So you kind of see him coming, right? There's your firewall. Those are all the walls around your perimeter. And then, so your hacker or your advanced, trader will figure out a way to either climb over your fence or punch a hole through it. And because he knows every single, defensive mechanisms you've put in place, he's going to be able to step around them to do what he wants. And he's going to do that for a long time. Most of the time, we find out years later. Okay, and when we find him, or we discover him, what we'll do is we'll try to signature him. So we'll put his picture everywhere and ask the world, have you seen Buffered Tannen? Or have you seen Turla? We have a finite signature. We'll put it on a big poster. What we've just told the adversary is exactly what we're looking for. So all he has to do is shave his face, change his hat, and all of a sudden he's back in, right? He doesn't look the same. Okay, where are these things going now? I think, you know, I chose this picture. I quite like this picture because it's fingerprint-less finger. It's hard to tell from the screen, but you have to believe me. So it's somebody that's, you know, managed to erase his fingerprint from his thing. And I think that's quite important because a lot of the security solutions being developed and put forward, or very popular these days, are based on aggregating log events and aggregating, you know, network events and things like that, and putting them together and putting the smarts to analyze them and be able to detect attacks. Well, if the guys are coming around without the fingerprints, what kind of clues are you going to have in your logs? What kind of clues are you going to have on your, you know, on your IDSs? You're not going to have much, and it's a hard problem. Okay, the other trend that's happening is people use what I call virtual machines to actually run interesting code. And this is my own, in my mind, this is what a Java virtual machine looks like. It's this big thing that can do all kinds of things, but it's really hard to actually follow what goes on inside, right? And this is a perfect place to hide. It makes the signature-based detection quite harder because, you know, high-value offensive people will try to utilize those more and more in the future. So it's a new trend. The other thing that they're going to try to do is use legitimate protocols. They'll throttle their network activity to actually mimic what really goes on the network. It's really easy to put a sensor to listen, you know, how much traffic is coming out of this box? Let's add 2% to that. Okay, you know, how am I going to be detected, right? So these are the trends. We can see that more and more. People actually blending in the noise, trying to use real legitimate protocol, right? Oh, this machine uses SSL, coming out SSL. All right, this machine doesn't use SSL, only uses HTTP. I'm going out HTTP. These kinds of things are coming out more and more. Instead of using the big old orange Doom buggy as their remote access tools, they're starting to use smaller, memory-only, file-less little things, right? They're very agile. They're not quite as noisy, not quite as visible. They're still very, very easy to maneuver around, but they don't leave traces. You know, if this flies over this building, unless you see it fly over, there's no traces. Whereas if a Doom buggy, you know, drives around, there might be tire marks, right? So this is the significant difference that we're seeing in advanced malware these days. Okay, so now you're saying, well, how do they actually achieve persistence, right? If it's memory only, all I have to do is reboot my boxes every night, then and the problem's solved, right? I've only got potential intrusion for one day. Well, you know, the advanced stuff is moving away from things that we're looking at. You know, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the person at the other end of the stick, right? The guy that's doing the offensive, he's going to try to figure out what the defensive side is doing, right? And the defensive side is looking at most of the stuff that we use on a day-to-day basis. But then there are a lot of devices that are connected on our network that either we've forgotten about, or you know, they sit in the back of a closet. It was a special project 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and for whatever reason, that box was never turned off, right? Never got updated, and nobody's looking at it, right? Perfect place to put your backdoor. Might be a phone sitting in the, you know, janitor's closet somewhere. Who's going to go and look and do forensics on that one, right? Or it could be your air conditioning system, you know, sitting somewhere, right? These things are just as important as your computers, or your servers that hold the data, right? They might not contain any information of value, but they actually give a presence on the network, right? That allow people to actually move around and do lateral movement inside your network. I used to joke that, networks are like a caramel. It's a bit crunchy on the outside, but very gooey on the inside, right? And that's still the, for most people or most organizations, that's still the model that they use. They use a lot of very heavy fortification around their network, on the perimeter of their network, but inside they don't keep very much, security, right? Light bulbs, you can toasters, fridges, Blu-ray players, everything that can be connected can be a target for persistence, from an offensive perspective. Okay, so this leads me to a couple of hard truths that I have to tell you. Okay, so this has been said several times, throughout this conference, but really, the prevention of high-value cyber offensives has to be done with a human, right? We have to bring down the fight to a human level. It is a cyber defender against a cyber offender. It's not a piece of, cyber security software against a piece of cyber offensive malware, right? And, the question goes without saying. We also have to change our mentality in the sense that right now, the security products that we have out there, they all tend to aim at minimizing the false positive. And what I mean by that is they don't want to show you an event that's real normal activity and make it look like you're under attack, because it scares people out of their mind when they see that red thing pop up on their desk, on their desktop saying, oh, you've been infected by Turla. And all of a sudden, phone calls start going and it's the end of the world, right? So as an industry, people have tended to shy away from having these false positives. The problem with false positives is, minimizing false positives is it introduces false negatives. And a false negative, just so you understand, false negative is when, an attack has really taken place and you've said, that's normal, it's all good. Yeah, come on in. Let's have fun, right? So that's the thing. You cannot balance both. We have to be able to take it to the human level where a human will actually look at the thing and say, yeah, that's probably normal. Given the behavior and all the surrounding information I can gather, this is probably normal, even though the threat popped up saying, maybe you want to look at that. It's not a red thing. It's probably a yellow thing that shows up and say, yeah, you might want to look at that. And sometimes it will be a real intrusion, and sometimes it might not. But I think it's a mentality shift that we have to change. It's not a system that tells you, it's not an alarm system that, is a for sure thing that somebody has gone through this door, right? The other thing is every single time somebody triggers your alarm, they get information about your defensive position, right? So you have to be careful about how you actually go and blurt out your alerts. Right? If I know that if I poke you this way, you're going to start screaming, and then I'm going to try to poke you a different way. And I'm going to try, if I poke you long enough, I'll know exactly where all your defenses are, because sometimes I'll poke and nothing happens. I'm like, oh, that's good. I'll keep doing that. And then oh, all of a sudden there's big red alarm going off. Well, I'll back off and go and do something else. The other thing that was alluded before is the time it takes, that these things take place over, right? And here, I'm a bit out of my league in terms, I don't know much about human resources, but from my reading on the internet, you know, your average network administrator will stick around in that job in one particular department for something between 18 months and 2.4 years. And that depends on your country you're in and, you know, a bunch of different factors. But it's somewhere between 18 months and 2.4 years. That's not long. You know, we're looking at advanced persistent threats, you know, and I'm using the persistent thing that have been going on for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. What does that mean? That means that the adversary knows more about your network than your network administrator. You have to think about that, because that's very important. You know, if the adversary knows more about your system than you do, you're in trouble. And I will never hammer this enough. There are no great weapons without somebody behind the driver's seat. The human brain and the human soldier will always be the most agile force that we have, right? And even the drones are controlled by humans. You know, technology is an enabler. It's not a solution. You have to think about this. We have to bring down the fight to a human level, and it'll always be that. It's a human which has traits and ways of doing things against a human that has, you know, ways of doing things. And the greatest thing about a human is that they will never answer the same stimulus in the same way, day after day, right? So they're unpredictable, and that makes it a lot harder to step around them. So that's why I'm saying it's important that we keep the human in the loop for really doing cybersecurity. So in conclusion, I believe that the days of the traditional antiviruses and the network IDSs, they're counted. You know, the buffer Tannen picture, you know, trying to signature things. Yes, it works for the low-hanging fruits, but the high-value things, it's getting harder. And we have to think differently. The technology has to evolve to reducing the false positive, to actually stop from putting people in the thinking that they're not protected, right? Or that they're protected when they're not. Real cybersecurity has to be performed by a human element. I've said this, and it's not code against code. It's a cyber defender against a cyber fighter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, if anyone has questions, please raise your hand and ask the microphone. All right, there's the first one.
Thank you for the presentation. And my name is Delian Nestrov, UI Ireland. And the question is for all the presenters. I would like to ask, what are your thoughts on how the cloud will affect the future of advanced targeted attacks? Is it better if a company move their resources to the cloud, where eventually there are more and better cybersecurity professionals, or should the government create government cloud, or better to keep the data in-house?
Anybody wants to take that?
I can at least try and start. I mean, it comes down to a question of, like you mentioned as well, concentrating things into one place, for instance, into the cloud, usually will help in the sense that then you can also have the pros in the same place and you can put more effort into keeping it secure. And for instance, the current public clouds put a lot of effort and resources into the security. But of course, then there's the problem of putting all your eggs in one basket or moving stuff into one place. And perhaps even bigger problem of you don't really know how it's being secured anymore, and you can't really affect that. You just have to trust and rely. And so you're placing a lot of trust on someone else at that point. So I think that there isn't a clear answer. I think it depends on the case in many ways, but I think those are the two factors that you have to really think about.
Couldn't agree more.
I may also add just one thing. Yes, cloud infrastructure have very well-trained security teams, and they do have lots of mechanisms and systems of monitoring that organizations usually do not have. And that, of course, may be very effective against low-hanging fruit, as was said before. But in the end, if there is an advanced attacker that is very well motivated and with quite a lot of money on his pocket to attack you, even if your infrastructure is in the cloud instead of in your premises, he will probably find a way out. So it will mainly improve the situation for the low-hanging fruit, for simple attacks, automated attacks. It will probably not change much in the APT scenario. My perspective, of course.
I encourage you to ask also specific questions from Mark. Anyone? Okay, well, I can ask about this reverse engineering. You have been years in the area. I know the answer is short, but maybe you can elaborate more. What is the best thing in doing this work? Why are you doing this?
Why am I doing this? Because, well, two reasons. The first reason is because, well, I don't reverse engineer stuff for fun. I tend to reverse engineer malware. Let's just make this straight.
There's a big difference.
Let's put things in perspective. The reason I do that is because I think that everybody is allowed their own privacy and everybody should have their security. And I'm trying to do my piece to make this a better place and secure the world. But what really turns my crank when I do the reverse engineering is when I figure out a new trick. Because, you know, there's a lot of smart people out there, both on the offensive and the defensive side. And when you learn a new trick, it's very motivating.
Okay, thank you. I cannot see any hands. But actually... There is one. Oh, all right, good.
Hello, thank you for the last presentation. It was very nice, but you said that we must keep people in the loop always. I totally agree for the persistent threat and at the present situation, but as the technology grows, autonomous vehicles are coming into our lives, and there will be no drivers, no defensive person, and then at that time, we need to expect from our cars to defend our cars autonomously. So what do you think about this?
Well, I'll use another analogy. Is the best fighter plane right now autonomous? Will it ever be autonomous? Might be remotely controlled. That I completely agree. But will we ever, you know, remove completely the human? I think maybe in the distant future, but not in the short term. In the short medium term in technology is, you know, 1 to 3 years, you know, 5 years at the most. I cannot see that within the next 5 years that, you know, fighter planes are going to fly themselves and make actual tactical decisions. I don't believe that. Will the cars drive themselves, you know, in well-known boundaries and things on the highway? Maybe. And how we're going to defend them, it depends what you want to defend them against. You know, if you're looking at advanced, you know, threat actors, I'd say, you know, autonomous system will only, you know, weed out the chaff, but the high-level threat actors will still be there.
Okay, thank you. So we want to thank you with the great present from Estonia.
Thank you.